Welcome back to part 2 of this module on climate change and society. In this part, we are going to talk about politics, politics related to climate change responses, politics related to climate science, but also and very importantly, though we may not like to think of it in that way, politics is very centrally linked to issues of ethics and values. So, it is not surprising that much of the discussion, much of the literature, much of the studies on the political dynamics of climate change are to do with issues related to ethics and values. So, we are going to focus on the politics of climate change. Some key Indian and foreign scholars who have contributed extensively to thinking about the politics of climate change, but also as I said earlier, the politics of the science around climate change, where we will discuss issues related to uncertainty and ignorance. And across these two aspects, we are going to bring in ethics and values in very significant ways. The key discussion on politics and climate change originates in the problem of inequalities. Inequalities at the global level, inequalities at the domestic level within a country. One of the important problems identified here is that climate change does not affect everybody equally. So, there is a problem of responsibility and fairness, that is, some societies or some countries are more responsible for global warming, but the impact may be felt by some other societies. So, for example, a lot of small island countries are likely to be affected adversely by climate change impacts, even though they have not been the major contributors to emissions to global warming, and that is true at the domestic level as well. So, the impacts of sea level rise or cyclones or heat waves or droughts may be felt by communities which in fact do not contribute that much to emissions. The other key problem related to the politics is the issue of development versus mitigation. So, many developing countries like India insist that because of the high levels of poverty in their countries, because millions of people are not able to meet their basic needs, there is a need to focus on development, and therefore, there is a need to invest more in industrialization and to consume more fossil fuels. Because of this, such countries, the governments say that they will not be able to contribute to mitigation. This is posed as a problem of injustice, because certain countries have already become developed. So, they argue that climate change mitigation is used as an argument to keep certain countries at a lower level of development or economic growth. So, an interesting example to show in the classroom would be Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Sequel, where towards the end of the documentary there is a very excellent portrayal of the stance of the Indian government in the Paris negotiations, and how this issue of development versus mitigation and the unequal impacts was addressed by different countries coming together and promising India to provide financial and technological support to shift from fossil fuels to renewables. At the same time, the political issues are also about the economic systems and the elitist policies that countries face. So, Praful Bidwai, the journalist in India, has been one of the key figures to extensively research and write about climate change impacts in India, but also he has extensively covered India's participation in climate negotiations over the last 3 decades or so. So, he says that most governments pay only lip service. They recognize the dangers of anthropogenic climate change, but they do very little. So, they are focused on certain kinds of economic policies, certain kinds of industrialization and economic growth, which exacerbates the problem of anthropogenic climate change rather than mitigate global warming. Also, a key problem here is that because the poor of developing countries face or are exposed to climate risks much more than the others, there is a problem of injustice wherein the state or the government adequately does not invest in adaptation strategies for these sections of the population. So, this is also seen as a problem of injustice, as a political problem, wherein ethics and values do not inform the strategies on mitigation and adaptation taken by governments. At the global level, it is essentially been about the fairness of agreements and global negotiations, and those who you can use the different kinds of negotiations that happen at various climate meets around the world over the last 20 years or so, to bring up issues of how politics plays a very important role in these negotiations, how power is used, how certain countries, in spite of having a legitimate position on climate change, are unable to get their voices heard. So, the fairness or lack of fairness of these agreements can be brought in not only in disciplines like sociology or anthropology, but these are key issues in political science and philosophy, where justice issues are discussed in terms of the framework of fairness. Yet another political aspect that is very important and that has made us rethink the idea of participation is about what action is to be taken to fight climate change. So, over the last 3 or 4 decades, there has been a gradual shift away from top down approaches in governance and development towards more bottom up or participatory decision making. However, with climate change, we have come to recognize that certain kinds of top down approaches are necessary. Some decisions have to be imposed from above. Certain kinds of technologies require huge amounts of investments. So, if you have to shift from fossil fuels to renewables, it requires investments on a scale which the private sector alone or individuals alone cannot do. Also, you need laws to be put in place to ensure that companies meet emission norms. So, again these have to come from above, because individuals or citizens cannot implement these norms. But does it mean that participation has no role in understanding climate change and in developing and designing responses to climate change? So, the key issue here is how seriously ordinary people are taken when it comes to climate issues. So, in part 1 we discussed the concept of climate ethnography. So, there is quite a bit of interest now in this idea of co-production of knowledge, that it is not scientists alone who have a monopoly over climate knowledge, that scientists may miss out on certain kinds of climate related problems because they are working mostly in laboratories or with large data sets, whereas people who are directly dependent on the environment for their livelihoods, farmers, fishers, pastoralists, other people who depend on the monsoon or the temperature which may affect their livelihoods, their sources of income, they may also have, through their own experience, specific kinds of knowledge about the climate, but this they may not have the power to make scientists and administrators take this knowledge seriously. So, while participation is very important as a mechanism of enhancing climate related knowledge and mitigating ignorance, at the same time we have to give ordinary citizens the power and the resources to get this knowledge accepted, to get this knowledge validated, and to get them incorporated into decisions and policies regarding climate change. So, what direction will this take? Is it only a question of adapting or coping with climate risks, or is it a question also of transformation that we discussed in part 1? So, participation may only go a certain distance if we only incorporate a very narrow band of knowledge into adaptation to cyclone, for example, in one particular district of India, or to address drought in one particular set of villages. But what if participation from below also makes us rethink the very idea of what kind of a society we want to live in, what kind of human beings we are, how do we ensure dignity and responsibility to others. So, Praful Bidwai cites Gandhi's critique of industrialism and consumerism here to talk about how the climate debate should bring scientists and ordinary people together to provoke a serious engagement with our current lifestyles, modes of production and modes of consumption, because unless there is a radical shift in how we produce and consume, perhaps it is not possible to seriously address the risks posed by climate change. On the other hand, there is also another group of activists and scholars who would argue that human beings are ingenious enough to devise technologies to address whatever problems may arise due to this culture of industrialism and consumerism. Now, in both cases we are talking about particular cultures, cultures of innovation, cultures of technology development, but also cultures of production and consumption. And in both cases there are serious discussions about human dignity, responsibility and ensuring that we do not cause damage to the environment and to ourselves and our future generations. The point here is that in both kind of cultural perspectives we are talking about politics, we are talking about who has the power to make these kind of decisions, who should participate in these debates, how they should be incorporated into policies. And therefore, it is from that perspective of politics that we are saying that some people may not have the power to influence decisions. Therefore, in spite of having adequate knowledge about climate change and its impacts, there still may be social limits to what we can do. So, this idea of social limits is also a political problem. So, if we know that we have to act in particular ways, but we do not, we have to ask questions about why we do not, and this is where questions of values, ethics, knowledge and culture become very central to this particular discussion. So, this is where not just the social sciences and humanities, but practically all disciplines can try and bring values and ethics and risk and knowledge into their discussions of climate change, but also into fundamental discussions of their own discipline, how that discipline is taught and practiced. The critique of this social limits to climate action comes from an understanding from research that certain kinds of adaptation to climate change, which is purely ecological or technological or physical or economic, are no longer going to be adequate. The problem has gone beyond these. So, for example, insurance to cover risk, okay, or cyclone warning systems, or ensuring that we protect biodiversity in certain kinds of hotspots where they are vulnerable to climate change. These may not be enough. If these are not enough, how do we understand, how do we bring in values and ethics to overcome the existing limits to adaptation? So, what is being said is that the traditional kinds of adaptation, technological, physical, economic, do not help us to adapt in the long term. They can at best be useful in the short term. If we have to ensure sustainability in the long term, if we have to address problems of global warming, cut down emissions, adapt ourselves to climate risks in the long term, we need to rethink values, ethics, risks, knowledge in very different ways. So, there are 4 propositions given by Adger and others on this particular problem. So, number 1 is something that relates to ethics. From the ethical perspective, it is said that any limits to adaptation depend on the ultimate goals of adaptation, which are themselves dependent on diverse values. So, let me explain what this is about. Basically, we are saying here that values are central. Okay. Historically, any discussion of politics had values as their base, even though there may be a complete lack of values in politics at a particular point of time in a particular kind of society. But almost all kinds of social units are defined by different kinds of ethical principles. Now, when it comes to adaptation, the core ethical principle or value that we are trying to use here is to say that human well-being is of utmost importance. We do not want people to be adversely affected, we do not want people to die, we do not want people to lose their livelihoods. But then there are so many different kinds of values that people have, everybody does not have the same kind of values. So, certain cultures may be very consumerist, certain cultures may be very austere, certain cultures may regard nature as sacred, other cultures may wish to exploit nature much more. So, when there is this diversity of values, how do you take an ethical position that ensures the social well-being of all? And here it is suggested that the one good ethical way to do this is to firstly through research, we describe concretely all the different value systems of different stakeholders, different groups who are engaged with addressing challenges of climate change. Second, we try and find out how these different groups with different value systems can actually participate in the decision making. This is not very easy because some of these values may be incommensurable. So, within environmental studies, for example, there are discussions about Gandhian environmentalists and Marxist environmentalists and liberal environmentalists, all of whom come from different value systems. They have different ideas about the economy, they have different ideas about what technologies should be used, about what kind of state institutions should enforce these rules. In such a context, this incommensurability of values makes it very difficult for us to come to a specific understanding about how best to adapt to climate change. Within this, there is a further problem in the form of power, that certain groups may have more power to make decisions to push their own value systems against those of others. The key question is whose value should count? Is it that of the government? Is it that of the people? Is it that of international organizations and agencies? Is it that of the corporate sector? So, this is a key limit identified to climate action, and the solution that is suggested, the proposition that is suggested is that there is a need to create institutions which create a dialogue between different groups having different value systems and empower each one of them to put forward their own ideas, their own models for addressing challenges of climate change. The second point is about knowledge. So, the proposition reads as follows: adaptation need not be limited by uncertainties associated with foresight of future climate change. Now, why is this a key political issue? Because historically we know that certain individuals or certain groups have a lot of foresight, others are more focused on the present. Okay. This could be because of cultural reasons, this could be because of pressing current concerns. So, a poor person cannot be expected to think of sustainability of future generations. That person, he or she, is more concerned about meeting his or her needs in the present at this particular point of time. So, economic reasons, cultural reasons, ethical reasons may define how people are future oriented. Okay. So, but the future is very uncertain. So, in spite of advances in climate science, there are a lot of things that are still uncertain, whether it is about temperature increase, the impact on monsoons, on cyclones and so on. So, a key problem here is that because of these uncertainties in planning for the future, we do not know how to adapt, and because we fail to adapt to the future, certain sections of the population are likely to be more vulnerable. So, you create immediately a problem of inequality by creating a set of groups who are vulnerable because we fail to anticipate the future. Now, how do we approach the future then in this kind of a scenario? So, different people, as I said, have different kinds of foresight. The idea here is to foster social and organizational cultures that give importance to foresight or to future orientation. So, it could be, for example, through insurance for farmers, so that they can take risks in experimenting with their cropping patterns and systems to cope with climate change. So, even if they fail over a period of time, they will arrive at an optimal cropping pattern which will adapt to maybe frequent droughts or freak weather events like hailstorms. Okay. So, the idea is to make people more interested in planning for the future, create a capacity to look ahead and plan. So, one of the key, so there is a key motivation here to support certain kinds of research agendas. So, both in teaching and research, what we need to do is to create skills of how to assess robust adaptation strategies. Which kind of strategies are more future oriented, which kind of strategies minimize losses in the present while people experiment planning for the future. So, this particular proposition gives us a very direct handle on how to teach and how to research, how to guide our students when dealing with this kind of political issue related to uncertainties regarding the future. Number 3 deals with risk. So, this proposition says that social and individual factors limit adaptation action. That is, even though we may have knowledge about how to adapt to climate change or climate change impacts, there can be very specific individual or social factors which limit what people actually do. So, we know that there is a big gap between perception of risk and acting upon risk. So, an individual may know that he or she has a risk of falling ill or dying in the future, but may not take insurance. Similar is the case with climate risks. So, a lot of people know that risks are going to happen, but because of the uncertainty of risk, it may happen in the next 5 years, it may happen after 50 years. They think that we can get away by not planning for it, not adapting to it, not ensuring for it. So, it could be because some people do not perceive risk, do not take it seriously enough. It could be out of habit. So, this is a very interesting area of research and brings in culture in a very central way, that we are just used to doing things in particular ways. Okay. We know that we should not always have air conditioning on because it contributes to emissions, we still do it. We know it is better to take public transport than own a private vehicle, we still do it. Some things are just more convenient, some things we are just habituated to doing things in particular ways. It is not easy to change those cultures of habit. It also depends on other aspects of our physical and social life, age for example. So, people who are older may not be able to adapt in specific ways. So, a lot of studies in Japan, in France have shown that when drills are carried out for disaster management, older people are not able to participate in the same way. Older people are not, their needs are not catered to in disaster mitigation plans. So, people who are older may have ignorance of certain kinds of issues, they may lack the financial capacity to invest in adaptation, okay, or they may just not be physically able to be prepared to deal with climate related risks. So, there are all these kinds of factors because of which individuals and groups are limited in their adaptation action. In the Indian context, gender also plays a very important role. So, if for example, individual households are required to make decisions to cope with climate change, change their cropping pattern, borrow money to shift to a new crop, undertake some measures to prevent soil erosion, invest in water as an adaptation mechanism if there are frequent droughts. But women may not have the power to make those decisions, women may not have the financial capacity, women may not be given the loans to implement those measures, women may not be eligible to get the subsidies to implement those measures. So, various issues related to social status, to inequality, related to habit, to age, to disability, all of these affect our individual decision making as well as collective decision making. There are also other reasons cited here at the social level, pure inertia, okay? We are just too lazy to do anything. So, because of these kinds of reasons, we fail to act adequately to adapt. So, once again these could be very interesting areas of research as well as activity within the classroom, using examples from your own areas or using examples from one's own country and region. One could do small surveys, or one could work out scenarios, one could do experiments to find out on what basis individuals and collectives or groups perceive risk, and how do they act upon risk or do not act upon risk. The final proposition which informs the social limits to climate action is about culture. This proposition states that systematic under evaluation of involuntary loss of places and culture disguises real experienced but subjective limits to adaptation. So, this is a bit of a complex issue. So, what does this mean? So, this proposition says that even when societies and governments take climate change seriously, even when they take adaptation action as necessary and imperative, there are some issues that are neglected. So, what is included here as being neglected are cultural assets. So, these cultural assets could be places of worship, these cultural assets could be important species of trees or plants or water bodies. So, there are places which have cultural meaning to people. A river is not just a body of water, a river also has a sacred meaning. Forest can be a sacred grove, so which gives identity to the people living there. So, we are doing some research in the coastal Kolivadas, the fishing villages of Mumbai, for example, where one of the things they are trying to preserve are the traditional temples which have gods and goddesses which are unique to the fishers. So, even as the city is changing, even as they are affected by climate change, by encroachments, by sea level rise, one of the key things they are trying to protect is those places of worship, because that is very important to protect their identity. So, it is not just about loss of livelihood, income, loss of space, it is also about these. These are also important for human beings, because human beings are not just physical bodies. So, they have an intrinsic social value to groups. Therefore, when these are undervalued, it is felt that people are not serious enough in designing adaptation strategies or in implementing adaptation strategies, because these do not address things that are important enough for them. So, there are a series of examples of places and culture that one could identify. If people are forced to move from one place to another, what are the things that they lose? So, because of climate change, they may be forced to move to other places. Do they lose their jobs? Do they lose access to their places of worship? Are they able to use their language? Do they lose their community because each of them is moved to a different place? What about family relationships, marriage relationships? Do they go to schools and colleges where aspects of their culture are not taught in textbooks? So, there are a series of intangible cultural assets that are also very important for human beings to function. So, adaptation has to consider these aspects as well in order to be successful. Now, why does this not happen? Part of the reason is that the key actors involved in designing adaptation strategies are ignorant about these cultural assets. But there are also other aspects of ignorance and uncertainty that we are bringing up here. Now, we know that climate science, despite its advances still creates a lot of uncertainties. For example, we may be able to predict a cyclone, but the direction of the cyclone is still a little bit difficult. Whether the cyclone will weaken or strengthen, still we do not have the science to predict it accurately. We also have certain amounts of knowledge. There are certain things about which we are ignorant. Given this uncertainty, how does it affect the politics of adaptation to climate change? Firstly, because of this uncertainty, states and governments may use it as an excuse not to channel investments and financial resources effectively to address these problems. We have seen it in the United States, we have seen it in India, we have seen it in many countries. What happens is that leaders in countries who are supposed to take strong positions to support people to protect them from climate change impacts, they use this uncertainty to say that there is no causality between the anthropogenic climate change and certain kinds of adverse impacts in the form of hazards. Because of this uncertainty, there is also a possibility, so this is both a cultural and a political issue, there is also a possibility that people lose trust. So, one of our studies documented how in the east coast of India, in Andhra Pradesh, fishing communities after some time just did not take these warnings seriously, cyclone warnings, and because they stayed back when cyclones struck the coast, there was loss of life, loss of property, injuries to people and so on, and that was because of uncertainty. So, sometimes the cyclone warnings came true, sometimes it did not come true. So, is it necessary that we have to have complete accurate information before people can build trust? That is not necessary. What is important is to explain to the people who are likely to be affected that there is uncertainty, but it is better to be safe than sorry. Okay. This can help us to improve the effectiveness of policies and strategies related to adaptation. But there is a key problem related to the overall politics of science itself. So, here Sheldon Ungar makes a very interesting point about what he calls as the knowledge ignorance paradox. That is, as science keeps growing all the time, there is also an expansion of highly specialized knowledge, but this knowledge cannot be understood by all. So, while knowledge is expanding, there is also scientific illiteracy that is spreading at the same time. So, when knowledge is expanding, people are also becoming more and more ignorant about specific aspects of a problem. So, knowledge about climate change is increasing, the specific kinds of adverse impacts of climate change and how we need to adapt, there is large scale ignorance even among well educated people. Now, how do we address this? How do we bridge this gap between this ignorance and this knowledge? And this is where Ungar offers some very interesting solutions, which in fact can be taken up by people in literature, in philosophy, in film studies, in all these kinds of humanities and arts disciplines, in art history, painting and so on. So, he gives the example of the ozone layer. When the ozone layer and the hole in the ozone layer began to be discussed in the 1980s and 1990s, it was taken very seriously by governments, by ordinary individuals. A lot of people took interest in it. They said we must do something about it, and some action was also initiated. Whereas the same thing is not true of climate change. That is because one of the reasons that Ungar mentions is a particular term that he uses called bridging metaphors. That is, ordinary people and political leaders and bureaucrats were able to understand ozone layer better because popular culture in the form of comic books, novels, films, they used this idea of the hole in the ozone layer in their stories, and so people could understand this better. Whereas climate change has become so complex, the science of climate change has become so complex and has become so specialized that it is not being used adequately in popular culture, with the result that a lot of people have only very abstract knowledge about climate change, and therefore it is not translating into action and strategies. There are some examples. There is this emerging field called cli-fi or climate fiction or environmental fiction, in which to some extent some of these are being addressed. So, the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh has brought in climate change and environmental problems into his novels in a big way. So, these are ways in which we could bring in climate issues into the classroom in more imaginative and innovative ways to bridge this gap between ignorance and knowledge. The point about this ignorance is that they affect motivations, that is, even if there is fairly certain knowledge of anthropogenic climate change and its potential impacts, people are not motivated enough to do something unless it is part of their own imagination, it is part of their knowledge frameworks in which in ways in which they can understand, they can comprehend, not just as something that is abstract and published in highly specialized journals. Likewise, institutions, whether these are government institutions or norms or laws or NGOs, they may not take science and knowledge seriously enough, because they feel that there is a lot of uncertainty attached to this, because they think it is too abstract, they cannot understand it very well. So, this is not just about the abstractness, this is also about the contextuality, what is relevant for a particular society. Let me take one example which is appropriate to India. So, at the international level, a lot of the negotiations, a lot of the action is about temperature rise, thinking about 1.5 degrees and what it is going to do in the future to human beings and to societies and to economies. In India, most of us working on climate change are much more interested in what is going to happen to the monsoons, because 60% of the population depend on the monsoons directly in rural areas. The national economy, including the urban economy, the industrial economy, is also dependent on the monsoon, because it generates a certain amount of well-being, a certain amount of income, a certain amount of kind of positive effects which are also psychological. Governments fall or rise based on whether you have a good monsoon or a bad monsoon. So, the monsoon is crucially important for a country like India, whose agriculture and economy is wholly dependent on a good monsoon. So, what is going to be the impact of global warming or climate change on the monsoon? The research done on that is very little, especially at the international level. Because of that, governments also do not tend to take it seriously, institutions do not tend to take it seriously. Okay. So, the translation of knowledge into policy and strategy is dependent on a certain kind of ignorance. In this case, we are talking about the lack of sufficient focus and research on the monsoons. We also see that the presence of ignorance about a particular problem or a particular understanding of climate change also means that it is absent in public culture, which I have already talked about, through comic books or novels or in the media or in films or television shows. So, why is it that we have more Saas Bahus than cyclones in our TV shows? Okay. It also affects, very importantly, technological strategies. So, we ourselves have documented how a lot of technological strategies are implemented to address climate change, either because they just borrowed from some other country or because they lend themselves to huge government investments and therefore to corruption. So, the informed decision making about technological choices in addressing climate change has to alleviate some of the ignorance about the adverse impacts of anthropogenic climate change. And here the bridging metaphors, the dissemination of information and knowledge about climate change through popular culture is very important. The final part of this particular module focuses on a very well known work by the sociologist Anthony Giddens, who is one of the most well known sociologists in the world and who was the director of the London School of Economics. So, he wrote this very famous book called The Politics of Climate Change, where he talks about a paradox which has come to be known after him, called the Giddens paradox. So, he is saying that today climate scientists are increasingly certain both about the nature of anthropogenic climate change and its intensity. But on the other hand, the paradox is that the general public is becoming less concerned with anthropogenic climate change. There is less public pressure to call for immediate comprehensive action to address climate change. Why is there this paradox? Because normally one would logically assume that if there is certainty about a particular problem, there would be calls for action to address that particular problem. One of the reasons because of this he says the general public becomes aware of climate change only when it is too late, only when there is a disaster. Okay? And sometimes it becomes very difficult to address to understand these problems in the case of something that is called as a creeping disaster, like a drought, because a drought is not like a cyclone which brings havoc and destruction and then goes away. A drought takes a long time to reveal its effects. So, very often we only grasp the significance of climate change impacts until it is too late. Also because, as we saw in the previous slide, climate change is too abstract to act upon. People want to see some dramatic changes and then they will act upon it. What are the reasons for this paradox? Giddens identifies 4 reasons. One, he says, is that a lot of very large corporate sector organizations invest a lot of money in campaigns against policy proposals to reduce carbon emissions, because those companies will then make losses if entire economies shift from fossil fuels to renewables. Number 2, climate science is too abstract, too vague, too much restricted to specialized journals, and therefore people do not understand problems of risk and uncertainty. Number 3, what is called as the free rider problem, that is, some countries can emit a lot of greenhouse gases and get away with it because the impact is felt by somebody else, and therefore there is no pressure on them to act. It is not looked upon as a global problem. And number 4, a lot of countries, especially developing countries like India, place a lot of emphasis on economic development because we feel we have to address the problem of basic needs of population, and therefore we think addressing climate change is not important at this stage of the economic growth. What do you do to address these problems? So, 4 suggestions are given by Giddens. Again, one, he says people, especially political leaders, have to be convinced that it is an immediate problem that must be tackled now. It is not easy, it is not impossible. The United States, for example, if you see, top level, national level leaders sometimes have been climate deniers, but a lot of governors of states have taken climate change very seriously and have invested a lot of resources, passed laws to address climate change. So, convincing political leaders is very important here. Number 2, we have seen that international negotiations are very fragile, very brittle. It is easy for countries to pull out of them. It is easy for countries to get away with not implementing the agreements. The suggestion here, the recommendation here is to go in for small regional level agreements. So, for example, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa can come together. ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries can come together. SAARC countries can come together. Smaller regions, it is easy for them to come to an agreement and to implement those agreements. Gradually things can be scaled up. Okay. This is seen as a more effective kind of solution. Number 3 is the most difficult, challenging the power of fossil fuel companies, but that can be done through campaigns, through knowledge, through advocacy, and through documenting the losses. So, one of these studies in which some of my colleagues were involved in was to show how if you do not implement action to address climate change, it can actually cause huge economic losses for the economy. That is one way to convince people, convince the skeptics. Finally, we need to promote much more local activism. So, a good example here again is the former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on climate change. So, he has a climate reality foundation which trains thousands of people and makes them into climate champions. So, these are people who go out into the world and try to bring about some action at local levels, at cities, city levels, municipal wards, villages, small neighborhoods, to bring about change. And those are likely to be much more successful, and you have an army not of soldiers, but of climate champions who will spread awareness of the need for addressing anthropogenic climate change. So, they can underpin and stimulate national and international political action. So, if you see what goes on in these international climate negotiations, you have a lot of these small climate champions going and putting pressure on the political leaders of their own countries to act smart. Okay. So, that is a good way in which we can begin to address climate change in a small way, even though we can begin to address this problem of the Giddens paradox. So, on this hopeful note, I will end this particular module on climate change in society, especially focusing on the political dimension.